So Jeffrey Dahmer really did ramp up his offending. The scale and the nature of his behaviour became all the more grotesque. So he wasn't just killing people, dismembering them, and then disposing of their bodies. He started to do some really bizarre things.
He was in the process of constructing some hideously diabolical shrine in his bedroom out of the skulls and skeletons of some of his victims. It's almost as though some bizarre, archaic thing had broken through and he was performing or creating some sort of ancient, human sacrificial temple in this little Milwaukee apartment.
In 1990, Dahmer killed another 4 young men. His MO was becoming more and more polished.
He would offer his victims money to go back to his apartment with him to take pictures, nude photographs of them, and then perhaps to have sex. Every single one of his victims went with him willingly. He would offer them a drink, and once he found out what they wanted to drink, he kept a lot of things on hand, different kinds of alcohol, and that's when he would put a drug in it that would put them to sleep, or that would relax them so that they would pass out.
They would pass out. He would then have sex with them while they were passed out, do with them as he wished, but of course they couldn't do to him. Then as they approached recovery, coming out of it, he would strangle them to death.
It seemed as though Dahmer got a thrill, not from the murder, but from the dead bodies of his victims.
Dahmer liked necrophilia. He liked sex with unconscious people. He wasn't a slasher in the sense that he took delight in killing. His purpose was sex with these people, company with these people. That's hard to believe.
He would commit necrophiliac sex acts on the corpses, dismember the corpses, dissolve parts of the bodies in these vats of acid he had, keep certain organs in his refrigerator, some of which he would actually cannibalize.
Dahmer said that the cannibalism that he engaged in was born out of a curiosity. He wanted to find out, first of all, what that would be like. He also said that there was an element of wanting to make these people a part of him, so they would be with him forever.
Dahmer, from the beginning, was driven by this terror of being alone. He said he killed his first victim, Stephen Hicks, when Hicks said he had to go, and Dahmer didn't want to be alone. There's some desire, which is part of normal sexuality. You love somebody, somebody will say, oh, I love you so much, I want to eat you up. With normal people, that's obviously metaphorical, but it does express some desire to be so close to the person that you want to incorporate them into, you want to merge with them. With somebody like Dahmer, that becomes this very literal horror.
And the horror only became worse when Dahmer began experimenting with his semi-conscious victims.
He would drill holes in their skulls and put muriatic acid inside to see if he could get them to a zombie state so that he could keep them alive and subservient to him.
It's essentially an amateur version of attempting to perform a lobectomy or a lobotomy, but it would be an incredibly unpleasant and damaging thing to do to someone's brain. If you affect the frontal lobes, you will affect personality, potentially make somebody docile. If he's less accurate, you could essentially cause a stroke that could cause paralysis, speech problems. It really very much depends on which part of the brain is actually damaged.
But, of course, that didn't work, and his victims died one after another. Hearing about that is the stuff of horror movies. And the fact that it was happening in a city where we were known for manufacturing and beer and a very good Midwestern work ethic, tight families, this isn't the kind of thing that happens here.
In May 1991, 31-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer was in his killing prime. He'd already murdered 11 men and had begun collecting bones and skulls from his victims and cannibalizing their organs. What would have been a nightmare for most was a fantasy for him. and he carefully went about his killings under the radar of the police and the people of Milwaukee.
Jeffrey Dahmer had a job in a local chocolate factory, and I think for him it enabled him to maintain a facade of normality. He was just an average Joe, a regular guy who went to work every day.
I think he killed so many people without being caught because of the fact that he looked like everyone else. He did what successful serial killers do. He blended. They blend in with society. Now, he was a Caucasian male living in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, but he didn't talk to anybody. He didn't bother anybody. He was barely someone people noticed. Barely noticed. He also was targeting people who, he found out, might not be missed.
For most people, if they were to commit the type of acts that Jeffrey Dahmer did, they would no way be able to function normally. But Jeffrey Dahmer was not most people. He hasn't got the same level of repulsion and shock at dead bodies or mutilated bodies that most of us have. It was just another aspect of his life.
It was not known that we had a serial slayer loose in our city. We did not know because he was so cleverly disposing of the bodies. The families were reporting the sons were missing, but the police were not finding bodies. And not infrequently, young men, something happens in their life, they just up and leave town. That happens enough that the police don't get worried. If it's a woman, they'll immediately commit resources to investigate, but young men, they don't.
But on May the 26th, 1991, Dahmer came agonizingly close to capture after an encounter with a 14-year-old boy.
Dahmer had taken Conrad Synthesymphone, a young Asian male who he found attractive. He met him in the mall, offered him money to go back to his apartment. He went, and he began to work the ritual. Dahmer would drug him, and then he began the process of this crude lobotomy, and he had drilled a hole in this young man's head. He took a break. He ran out to get more beer. While he was gone, Konarak ran out of the apartment. He was naked, he was completely dazed, and he was running up the alley next to Dahmer's apartment building. A woman in another apartment building saw him running up the alley and said, "There's a boy running up the alley, something's going on," and then these women called the police.
And then Dahmer appeared, and again, this is another remarkable characteristic of these psychopaths, is that they have an ability to maintain, a kind of coolness under the most extraordinarily high-pressured circumstances.
So he walked up to the officers. "Good evening, officers." He's very polite, he's sober, and he said, "This is my boyfriend. He came to stay with me. We had a little bit too much to drink, and he ran out of the house." He said, "How old is he?" Dahmer said, "He's 19. And the officers said, "Okay, well, just to make sure, let's all walk back up to the apartment together."
The cops went in and looked around. They even peeked into the bedroom where there was a decomposing corpse of one of Dahmer's previous victims, but, they took such a cursory look at it that they didn't even notice it.
Assuming the couple were having a lover's tiff, the two police officers left Konarak alone with Dahmer in the apartment building. And in the early hours of the morning, he murdered the 14-year-old boy. An opportunity to catch the killer had been missed.
I think that really speaks volumes about the attitudes of the police at the time in terms of ethnic minorities, in terms of young people, in terms of the gay community, and that was another victim that could potentially have been saved. So there's this terrible thing going on behind closed doors and people just aren't seeing it. People aren't wanting to see it. Even the police are not joining up the dots and finding out what's really going on. So this is allowed to just bubble away and get worse.
After evading capture, Dahmer was free to continue.
There was two sides, really, to Dahmer's pleasure that he got from killing his victims. So he was a sadist who enjoys the pain and suffering of other people. And with sadists, that thrill ends when the victim dies. But Dahmer was also something of a necrophiliac who was interested in having corpses around and doing things with those corpses. And that means that the thrill starts with death. So he has this continuous fulfillment going on. And he's always fully in control. And I think that's what's really at the root of Jeffrey Dahmer. It's power and it's control, and it's the feeling that he has all this knowledge about what he's done and nobody else quite knows what he's up to.
By July 1991, Dahmer's desire to kill had become insatiable. In just 16 days, he murdered 4 more men, bringing his total number of victims to 17. But Dahmer's reign of terror was about to come to an end. On July the 22nd, he met a man called Tracy Edwards.
While they were together in the apartment, Dahmer threw a handcuff on him. This was now the beginning of his ritual. Dahmer had taken photographs of his victims in various stages of dismemberment, Polaroids. And those were sitting on the dresser inside the bedroom. They weren't sitting out in the main living room, but there was some speculation that Tracy Edwards had perhaps seen that. And he ran out of the apartment in his underwear, ran down the street, and when he saw the police car, Tracy Edwards has said his intention was just to get the handcuff off. That's all he wanted. He stopped these cops to say, hey, can you just get this off of me? So he stopped, and the officers start talking to him about what he saw, and then they said, well, we should probably check this out. Let's all go back to the apartment. Dahmer answered, and the minute he saw that it was the police, he tried to shut the door on them. The police pushed the door open a bit. They started struggling with him, and then finally, he just gave in. And that was when Dahmer was officially finished. He was finished killing, and he knew that he was finished.
This killer's story begins in 1946. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on the 24th of November at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont.
This was the 1940s in America. The ideal nuclear family was mum and dad who were married, that nice family unit where everything is very neat and very defined. And people who were outside of that ideal really were stigmatized.
To avoid that judgment, Ted's 22-year-old mother, Eleanor, moved back to her parents' home in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where her parents brought up Ted as their own.
The unusual part of his childhood is how he's raised. He's adopted by his grandparents. He's raised alongside a person who he is told is his sister.
But she wasn't. She was actually his mother.
This arrangement went on for almost 4 years, with Ted's grandparents as his main carers.
His grandfather was quite a violent character, so that suggests to me that very early on in his life, he's almost in a bit of a survival mode. I'm not safe within this home.
Just before his 4th birthday, Eleanor moved to Tacoma, Washington. There she met and married Johnny Bundy in 1951. They formally adopted Ted when he was 5 years old. The couple had 4 children together, but Ted reportedly didn't form a close bond with his new family and still believed his mother was his sister.
Ted Bundy is somebody who has always been really conscious of his social class. He came from quite humble beginnings, that the family were quite poor, and he was really quite aware of that and really quite embarrassed and ashamed by it.
An exceptionally bright student, Ted Bundy enrolled in the University of Washington in 1966 to study Chinese. There, aged 20, he met and fell in love with a woman called Stephanie.
This was his dream girl. This was the woman he was going to marry. This is the woman to which he was dedicated. It was romance in the realest sense that you could imagine it.
But she suddenly dumped him.
One of the reasons that she cited was that he wasn't ambitious enough. And I think this would have really hit Ted Bundy quite hard, because this feeds into his anxieties around his social class and those feelings of unease and those feelings of not being good enough. So what we've got happening here is this resentment brewing.
Bundy dropped out of university in 1968. The following year, he returned to the East Coast in what he later described as a bid to understand his roots. Whilst there, Bundy unearthed a family secret.
He discovers his true identity. He discovers that the woman that he's considered to be his sister for his whole life is actually his mother. And he discovers his birth certificate, and the birth certificate says he's illegitimate.
The two most important women to him, his mother and his mother's surrogate, and the woman he wanted to marry, in essence, both deny and abandon him. The significance to him of that is that women simply cannot be trusted.
Many people think this is something that just kind of came out of the blue, but I would say absolutely not, it didn't. I think this was an attack that was built up to. We often find with offenders there's some behaviour before they get to the point of raping and attacking people. And in Ted Bundy's case, this was voyeurism. So he had a history of peeping through women's windows and watching them get undressed. And it's something that gradually builds, and it's not enough for him, and he ratchets it up to the next level.
The violent assault left the young woman unconscious for 10 days.
She sustained injuries from the blows to the head. That will cause brain damage and brain swelling. And when he sexually assaulted her with a metal bar, that caused damage to her internal organs, and she was left permanently altered by those injuries.
Seattle, Washington, February 1974. It was here that 27-year-old Ted Bundy attacked again and turned from rapist to killer.
It's no coincidence that she's a university student who he sees as privileged, who he sees as undeserving, whereas he's somebody who's really hard done by. And it is that constant jealousy, that constant underlying feeling of shame that drives a lot of his violence.
Bundy's chosen target was a 21-year-old University of Washington student called Linda. He broke into her room.
He very severely attacks her. He really does bash her skull when he carries out the assault on her. She doesn't survive the attack.
That night, after he'd attacked and killed Linda, Bundy moved her away from the campus. He dumped her body in the dense woods of Taylor Mountain Forest, a 30-minute drive from the university.
It's very important that he maintains control over the victims, even after he's killed them. So he doesn't just leave them where they are. He wants to be able to know where they are. He wants to have control over them. So he chooses a local beauty spot, Taylor Mountain. It's a place that people generally go to enjoy. But for him, it really is a macabre dump site.
Linda's body was found a year later in 1975. Her death marked the start of a furious spate of killings. At this time, Bundy quit law school in Tacoma after just 6 months. He returned to Washington, not as a student, but as a predator.
He would lure women over to his car, saying that he needed their assistance with something. And he'd often be wearing a sling to make it appear that he'd injured himself. And he was good-looking, he was charming, he was respectable.
Bundy's trademark VW Beetle became his favorite method for abducting women before taking them to a remote spot to attack them.
When he hit, it was like a shark grabbing its prey. Bam!
He'd use a blunt object to bludgeon his victims, and then he'd strangle them.
After 8 aggravated murders of young women in the first half of 1974, a rate of more than 1 a month, fear spread across the Pacific Northwest.
I think Ted Bundy enjoys the feelings of power. He enjoys the feelings of control. So you start to see the attacks get closer together because he's having to escalate his offending to get that same feeling of power. We know with psychopaths like Ted Bundy, they're prone to boredom, so they will start to mix it up a bit and offend in different ways.
Then, in the summer of that year, Bundy changed his MO. He now decided to attack in broad daylight. On July the 14th at Lake Sammamish State Park, just over 15 miles southeast of the University of Washington, Bundy attacked 2 young women, 23-year-old Janice and 19-year-old Denise. Denise was last seen entering a public restroom in the park.
There are some witnesses to these crimes, and there's one common denominator, and that seems to be a man called Ted who drives a VW Beetle. So that begins to narrow the field a little.
Bundy later said that he kidnapped both women from the state park within a few hours of each other. He raped them and made one watch as he murdered the other. Around 2:45 a.m. on January the 15th, 1978, Ted Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house.
He's somebody who's familiar with college towns, with college buildings. So I think he knew that there were many women in this house, and that was his intention all along.
Within 15 minutes, he'd attacked 4 women, brutally, cracking their skulls, breaking their collarbones.
21-year-old Margaret was hit with a piece of firewood and then strangled to death with her stockings. 20-year-old Lisa was beaten unconscious, raped and killed.
The attack is incredibly brutal. There's rape, he beats people, he knocks people's teeth out, he bites the buttock of one of the victims.
The magnitude of the terror for the victim is as intense as the magnitude of the rage by the perpetrator.
2 others were both severely beaten and assaulted. Miraculously, they survived. Within the hour, the sheriff of Leon County, Ken Katsaris, was called to the crime scene.
When I got there, I did check with the investigators. They had secured the scene. We knew that we had 2 who were obviously dead, and 2 that they believed may die. You could tell which one was first. You could tell which one was second, third, and fourth. But you could tell how much energy that he expended.
This was not the end of Bundy's activity that night.
As I'm standing outside of the sorority house, we get a call that there's strange noises coming from a condo next door. And I sent an investigator immediately because I said, 6 blocks away, could it be? He's doing it again, which only tells you he couldn't help himself.
Bundy had broken into another apartment where he savagely beat another student.
She was in a pool of blood when my investigator went in the condo or the apartment, and Bundy was leaving out the back window, but she tended to the injured first.
Still free a few weeks later, Bundy struck again, this time in Lake City in northern Florida. His victim was another little girl who was just 12 years old.
He is a prolific serial killer at this point in time. Serial killing is his hobby, it's his vocation, it's something that he feels that he's good at, and more so, he's getting away with it. And when somebody's getting away with it, they're certainly not going to stop. And if anything, their offending is only going to get worse.
Bundy dumped the girl's brutalized body in woods about 30 miles west of Lake City. He then stole a car and made his way west into the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, on February the 15th, 1978, an alert Pensacola police officer stopped America's most notorious serial killer near the Alabama state line for driving suspiciously.
He just had a gut feeling that something might be wrong. And of course, it came out over his radio after he called it in that the vehicle had been stolen.
After a brief struggle in which the officer was forced to fire a warning shot, Bundy was arrested. He was taken to the Leon County Jail in Tallahassee, Florida. Peter Sutcliffe is one of the most infamous killers in British history. For 5 years, he evaded capture while brutally murdering 13 young women across the north of England. It was an investigation with twists and turns and a case that still haunts the British public to this day.
For years, women and girls felt that simply leaving their homes at night meant taking their lives in their hands.
When Sutcliffe was eventually apprehended on January the 2nd, 1981, it brought an end to a manhunt that had both terrified and captivated the nation. The press had dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper.
For women, it was a very frightening time, and they were stuck in this awful position of being told they shouldn't go out at night. It had an enormous social effect on the country.
As well as his 13 victims, Sutcliffe had attacked at least 7 more women. His arrest was a huge relief for the under-pressure detectives at West Yorkshire Police.
He attacked at random. We couldn't anticipate his moves. The whole of the north of England was held in a grip of terror, really, by this man. There was a sort of, I can only describe it as a Gothic-type cloud over the area.
But the Yorkshire Ripper's story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946 in the market town of Bingley on the outskirts of Bradford, West Yorkshire.
He was the youngest of quite a large family. His brothers and sisters were all of strong character. They were all working class, could look after themselves. But Peter was a shy boy and very much attached to his mother.
His mother was somebody who was very much dominated and controlled by his father. So I think he had quite a lot of sympathy for his mum, and he thought the world of her as a child. But Peter was somebody who was quite shy, quite awkward, he was quite skinny and scrawny. And I don't think he ever lived up to his father's expectations. And I think that planted that seed of shame in Peter Sutcliffe that would come to shape the rest of his life.
Sutcliffe's awkward demeanour as a child manifested into a dysfunctional adulthood, demonstrated in his early career choices.
Peter Sutcliffe had a variety of different jobs throughout his life. He worked as a gravedigger for quite a period of time, and it was reported that he stole things from the corpses that he was burying. Now that suggests to me that he wasn't horrified or repulsed by dead bodies, and that's something that would be quite influential later on.
On Valentine's Day 1967, 21-year-old Sutcliffe met Sonia Shermer. The pair began a long-term relationship, eventually getting married in August 1974.
The relationship that he had with his wife, Sonia, appeared to have been a decent one, and I think he would have treated her fairly well because she served a purpose for him. Women like his mother and his wife, he saw as carers and nurturers, people who would look after him. Other women, I think he saw somewhat differently. I think Peter Sutcliffe's view of women is very black and white. They are either Madonnas or they are whores. So they're either these perfect domestic angels or they're these sinful creatures.
These opposing views on women collided with one another when a family revelation dramatically altered 23-year-old Sutcliffe's world. His mother, whom he'd looked up to as a child, had been unfaithful.
His mother had had an affair with a policeman, and his father had decided to confront his wife at a hotel where she was meeting this particular man, and took Peter with him.
Peter's father basically humiliated her and said, look, I know all about what's going on, and the children found out as well. So I think this kind of further cemented ideas as to what women were, what could be expected of them, always to be cautious and wary of them.
I think there was every possibility that after seeing his mother and seeing what happened, that possibly preyed on his mind and affected his attitude towards women.
Sutcliffe began to visit the red light districts of Yorkshire and find solace in prostitutes. But his feelings for these women would soon lead to violence and eventually murder. On the morning of October the 30th, 1975, just 12 miles away in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, the body of 28-year-old Wilma McCann was discovered in a local park.
Wilma McCann was a Scottish woman who had come down to Yorkshire. She was working as a prostitute. She was very hard up, and it was very difficult for her because she had young children, young family to support. And I think that was the only way she felt she could get enough money.
The attack on Wilma McCann set in motion what would become a clear pattern and regular method of ambush by the killer.
His modus operandi was to use a ball-peen hammer and was to strike them very hard and very fast on the back of the head so they fell unconscious. He used his hammer and hit her over the back of the head, and then he stabbed her 15 times in the neck, chest and abdomen.
But the police were no closer to catching the killer, and 3 months later, on the 20th of January 1976, another woman was murdered in Leeds. 42-year-old wife and mother Emily Jackson. who'd vanished after a night out at her local pub. Emily's son Neil was 17 years old at the time. He remembers receiving the tragic news on that fateful morning.
I've come downstairs. My dad's loading one of the vans up for work, and I'm getting my boots on ready for going to work and having a pot of tea, when they were knocking at the door and it opened the police. And that's when I first knew. And I first knew when, like I said, for Dad, when the police knocked at the door. I can still remember it plain as day.
Again, a hammer had been used in the brutal attack. Emily had also been stabbed a total of 52 times with a screwdriver. Like Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson had been working as a prostitute to make ends meet.
It was just to help the family in dire straits, is what I've been told afterwards. When family were in hard times work-wise, she went elsewhere, but I didn't realise till well after.
This time, police were able to recover from the scene a key piece of evidence. On Emily's right thigh was a very firm and visible footprint from a size 7 Wellington boot.
For some inexplicable reason, he stamped on her thigh with such force that it left an imprint of the sole of his boot on her thigh. Now, police tried to trace that boot, or the manufacturers of the boot, which they did, and then try and find out people who had bought them, but it didn't come to anything.
Once again, the trail went cold. It was over a year until a murder with a familiar MO took place in Leeds. On the morning of February the 5th, 1977, the body of 28-year-old Irene Richardson was discovered. She'd been savagely murdered, another prostitute killed with a hammer. West Yorkshire police were suddenly dealing with a serial killer. What they didn't realise is that this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous series of murders in British history. Less than 3 months after the death of a third victim, Irene Richardson, the killer struck again. On the night of the 23rd of April 1977, 32-year-old prostitute Patricia Atkinson became victim number 4. She was murdered in her own flat, this time not in Leeds, but in nearby Bradford.
She believed that if she invited customers into her flat, she was safe because all the killings had taken place in isolated parks or back alleys. So she thought she was safe, but she wasn't.
The killer hit Patricia 4 times around the head with a hammer and then mutilated her body with a knife. This time, detectives found a clue to link the murders of Patricia Atkinson and Emily Jackson.
The police found the same boot mark on the bedclothes at Patricia's house, Patricia's flat, as they found on Emily Jackson's thigh.
This crucial link confirmed the authorities' worst fears. The killer was expanding his hunting ground, and he seemed to have a favoured target. All 4 murder victims had been working as prostitutes. On the 17th of November 1980 in Leeds, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student, was hit over the head, stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. An attack that bore all the hallmarks of the Ripper. But Jacqueline Hill would be Peter Sutcliffe's final victim. Within 2 months, a routine police stop would lead to one of the most sensational arrests of modern times. The capture of the Yorkshire Ripper.
Just after New Year, or January 2nd, 1981, Peter went to Sheffield and picked up a prostitute. On the same evening, a policeman with a lot of years of service decided to show a young rookie round Sheffield.
The 2 police officers spotted Sutcliffe's car near offices on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield's red light district. They decided to approach and talk to the pair.
The cops asked, what's your girlfriend's name? He said, I don't know, we've only just met. And the policeman said, you know, I haven't just fallen off a Christmas tree. So he already realised there was something odd going on.
Peter said that he needed to urinate, and the officers let him go up to a wall by the side of the building. While he was away, the young police officer did a PNC check on the registration of the car and found that the plates were false. So Peter was arrested and taken to Dewsbury Police Station.
Once down at the station, Sutcliffe was searched, He wasn't carrying any weapons, but this time detectives weren't going to let him slip from their grasp.
So one of them thought, let's go back to that place where we spotted him and let's see if he did leave anything when he popped out of the car saying he was going to have a pee.
The police returned to the scene of the original arrest.
They found the hammer, the intended murder weapon, and they came back with them. And gradually after that, Peter Sutcliffe realized that the game was up, and eventually he confessed. And his only condition was that he be allowed to tell his wife, Sonia, before it became known to the general public that he was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper.
It had been over 5 years since the murder of Wilma McCann, but detectives finally had the Ripper in custody.
Well, the Gein family moved to Plainfield from La Crosse, Wisconsin, partly because the mother of the family, the matriarch, Augusta, had decided that La Crosse was a kind of Sodom and Gomorrah-like hellhole, and she didn't want her children to be corrupted by all the immoral influences of the big city. Needless to say, La Crosse was not a particularly big city, but they moved to a remote farmhouse about 6 miles west of, you wouldn't necessarily say downtown Plainfield because there was no uptown Plainfield.
It's not the largest city in the state of Wisconsin, but it's plenty big enough for those of us that live here.
Plainfield was a very remote, isolated, featureless little village. A state guidebook at the time described it as totally nondescript. The population was very small, never more in its history, I think, than 700 or 800 people. You know, probably the entire population of the village could have fit into a New York City apartment building.
The Gein's 150-acre farm was located on the corner of Archer and 2nd Avenue. Ed rarely got to leave the property and socialize with other children.
His mother, Augusta, is a very domineering character indeed. She is a devout Christian and she has some very extreme ideas about sin and about morality. And she drums into her sons that they're not to socialise with anybody outside of the family because all of the people around them in the local town are sinners, they're evil, all the women are whores. And so she creates this very insular family environment where they're quite isolated from the rest of the community, and that has a really significant impact on them.
Gein seemed to have been very friendless whenever he would make some kind of friend. On those rare occasions, when he would try to make a school friend and bring home a school friend, the mother would immediately find some reason to disapprove of the other child and forbid Ed from ever bringing him home. So he grew up again in a state of complete social isolation.
And Gein's relationship with his father was also far from perfect.
Well, the father, George, was an alcoholic. He appeared to have been somewhat free in his use of physical punishment, but mostly the picture that emerges of George is of, kind of a hapless individual who was, as all 3 male members of the family were, under the thumb of his wife, and again, who was regarded as much as anything else as a sort of obstacle or impediment to the household.
As Ed entered adolescence, his life became even more insular.
He dropped out of school when he was around about 12 or 13 to work on the family's farm, and he was considered to be a bit of an oddball. He was quite a loner, and he enjoyed quite solitary pursuits, so he really quite liked reading and was quite a prolific reader. So he was somebody who didn't really fit in, but worked incredibly hard to keep the family farm going.
On a dark winter's night, officers from the Plainfield Police Department began to search the Gein farm for Bernice Wharton.
They couldn't get into the house, so they went around back and entered into what was called the summer kitchen, which was a little shed outside.
This property didn't have any electricity, so they were pretty much fumbling around in the dark with flashlights, but I don't think they expected to find what they did find there.
One of them turned on his flashlight and beamed it around and saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. Although it didn't look like a deer, they realized to their incredible horror that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels and been completely gutted.
She'd been strung up, essentially, and she was slit from her sternum to her pelvis. So she'd essentially been butchered by Ed. It really was the most grotesque thing that these officers had ever come across.
And they realized they had found the body of Berners Warden. And of course, both of them just stumbled out in horror and vomited, at the sight of this thing.
When the news spread across the town, the residents of Plainfield were in complete shock.
When I heard of his arrest, I couldn't believe it. I was sure they had the wrong person because it just didn't seem like anything that they were telling us was the Ed that we all knew. Yeah, it was a Saturday night. We were at a dance, and the story went through there, and everybody said, "I don't believe it," but it was true.
After finding the butchered body of Bernice Warden in a shed at Ed Gein's farm, the police officers moved their search into the main house.
He boarded up some areas of the family's home to maintain the rooms as his mother had left them. And in other parts of the property, he just started hoarding things. You would have trash and rubbish build up, and it really became a complete hovel.
He'd reverse the normal process of trash disposal, and instead of taking all his garbage to the dump, would go to the dump and bring it into his house.
But there was more than just household waste.
Amid all that wreckage, they discovered these incomprehensible, unspeakably awful objects that had been fashioned out of human body parts. There were chairs that were upholstered in human flesh.
There was a lampshade made of human skin. They found the remains of 12 human heads, gloves made out of the skin from a corpse's fingers.
There was a jar containing human noses. There was a box full of female genitalia, some of which had been painted and tied with ribbons. There was a belt fashioned out of female nipples. There was a shade pull made of human lips.
They found all types of things that belonged to people that were no longer people. And it was shocking. I mean, you think of this happening, now, it's still shocking. But back then, in a small, tiny rural community, it was absolutely, it was breathtaking.
Ed Gein's farmhouse was the habitation of a literal ghoul. Somebody who had been living amidst these horrific relics of human dismemberment. It was a madhouse.
Gein's fascination with death and corpses had been growing ever since his mother had died 12 years previously.
Ed had always enjoyed reading. It was quite a solitary pursuit, so that's not particularly surprising. But after the death of his mother and his brother, he started to read an awful lot more, and his tastes in literature really did span quite a wide spectrum. He read pornographic magazines, he read medical textbooks, and he developed a particular interest in Ilse Koch, who worked at one of the Nazi concentration camps and collected patches of skin of the prisoners who were detained there. And I think all of this was fueling a very active imagination. So he's developing these obsessions and these interests, and he's quite skilled as a farmhand at this point in time. He knows how to slaughter animals, he knows how to prepare carcasses. He's from a community that's very much into its hunting and its fishing. So at some point, reality and fantasy are going to collide.
As the search of the farmhouse progressed, officers found that the grotesque collection of body parts became even more disturbing.
Among the most hideous of all the items were human skin masks that were hanging from the wall of his bedroom, the faces of women that had been flayed from the skulls and that had been preserved. Some of them had lipstick applied to them and that had been hung on the walls as decorations. And then, most notoriously, there was a skin suit that Ed had crafted out of the upper torso of a woman and the leggings of a woman. And apparently, as he later confessed, he would put on this skin suit and put on one of the female skin masks and caper around in his yard, pretending to be his mother.
Gein's macabre collection had been acquired from the very same cemetery where his mother's body lay.
2 years after the death of his mother in 1947, he starts grave robbing. So he's going into a local burial ground, he's digging up bodies, and he's taking things from the bodies. Now, he's not taking jewellery or items of any value, he's actually taking body parts. It really is an absolute house of horrors. So what started off as an interest, which was confined to the pages of a book, has now become a reality behind the doors of this rather bizarre house. So what he's doing in a really grotesque way is trying to bring his mother back to life in some way, shape or form, because he was just so dependent upon her for a sense of his own identity.
And the search wasn't over yet. Officers would soon discover, inside a paper bag in Gein's home, the severed head of a woman who'd been missing from Plainfield for over 2 years. It was a series of gruesome murders that spread fear across California. When Richard Ramirez was finally apprehended by an angry mob in Los Angeles on August the 31st, 1985, it brought to an end one of the most prolific murderers in US history. Nicknamed the Night Stalker, the Satan-worshipping serial killer had terrorized the state of California for 14 months, claiming at least 13 victims. San Francisco detective Frank Falzon met Ramirez face-to-face 4 years after his conviction in September 1989.
About as evil as anything I can imagine. He was intent to hurt, and that's what people have to realize.
Frank worked hard to help capture Ramirez after the Night Stalker murders reached the San Francisco Bay Area in August 1985.
I served 22 years in the San Francisco homicide detail. Numerous cases were broke that I felt very good about. None as high as the Night Stalker. The fact that my partner and I and a few other gentlemen played a key role in breaking this case, it was probably the highlight of my career.
This killer's story begins over half a century ago. Richard Ramirez was born on February the 29th, 1960, to Mexican-born parents in El Paso, Texas.
He was the youngest of 5 children, and the family had quite a kind of turbulent life. So they lived in several different areas, many of which had quite high levels of industrial pollution. Some of his siblings had been born with birth defects. So this family had an awful lot of challenges. That's something that would come to shape Richard's life and those of his siblings. So he hasn't got the best start in life.
And life did not get much better for Ramirez. At a young age, he began rebelling against his strict Catholic upbringing.
He's 9, his brain is still developing, he's sniffing glue, he's smoking marijuana. There's emotional trauma that's happening in the family too.
His father was a brutal, short-tempered man. I'm not suggesting it was classic child abuse, but there was certainly physical violence. And Richie Ramirez shrank away, if you like, from his father. And he took refuge in the company of a cousin.
Ramirez's cousin, Mike, returned from the Vietnam War in 1971. He was scarred by the atrocities he'd seen and had committed as a Special Forces Green Beret.
So we have a grizzled, damaged Vietnam vet, Mike, and a frail, probably suggestible boy. And Mike proceeds to explain to him the dreadful things he's done to Vietnamese women while in Vietnam. He's tied them to trees, he's raped them, he's beheaded them, he's taken photographs of it.
He came home telling stories of this to Richard, and he would boast about it. So Richard now has a real-life killing machine to look up to and to admire.
12-year-old Ramirez was fascinated by his older cousin.
So he starts spending an awful lot of time with Mike. He's quite a significant influence on young Richard's life, and he's very impressionable at this age. So this really is kind of cementing some of those ideas that he's had about harming other people in order to feel powerful.
And that must have distorted Ramirez's value systems and the way in which he responded to women in general. They became objects, they were not real, and they became, how can I put it politely, not entirely human.
On May the 4th, 1973, Ramirez witnessed an event that would cement his feelings towards women and his admiration for cousin Mike.
He keeps his gun in the fridge because he says he likes to keep it cool. And this is another thing I think that quite impresses Richard. And one day Mike has a huge argument with his wife and ends up killing her. He shoots her in the face. And Richard is there in the house when this happens. What you've got here is it's a combination of things that have been going on. So a young lad who looks up to people who are violent, a young lad who hears stories of violence, and now he's actually seeing it happen.
Mike was a powerful influence in the direction of psychopathy, rage discontrol, and the merger, and this is the most important thing, the merger of sexual impulses and violent impulses into a single coherent force.
Now, the impact that must have had on a boy who's been taking marijuana with a man who he clearly hero worships, it must have scrambled Ramirez's brain.
And his reaction to it is quite interesting because when he talks about it afterwards, he doesn't talk about how he feels seeing this woman murdered in front of him. He talks about it very objectively. He talks about the body falling to the floor, about blood spurting out of the wound. It's not about feeling disgusted or feeling traumatized or sad. He's just giving a very cold description. And I think this really does tell us what kind of person Ramirez is turning into.
Mike was immediately arrested. In court, he was judged to be not guilty on the grounds of insanity. Instead of prison, he was sent to a mental institution and released in 1977.
Ramirez, in the meantime, because he's removed from his hero, goes to stay with his sister and husband.
He's lost his idol, he's lost his role model, and he is basically now starting to ruminate and to think about the things that he wants to do. So he doesn't look after himself, he's very unkempt, he's dirty, he doesn't wash, and so he becomes even more of an outcast. So he very much gets lost in his own head at this point in time, and he's planning what he's going to do next.
Age 17, Ramirez was ready to turn his twisted fantasies into reality.
While he was still at school, he got a job working at a Holiday Inn and he got a pass key for all the rooms. And he took it upon himself one day to decide that while the husband was away parking the car, he would go into the room that they just both moved into and he would attempt to rape the wife.
The husband comes in and he sees what's going on and basically beats Richard Ramirez to a bloody pulp. But this couple, they're from out of town, they're on holiday. They don't want to follow this up. They don't want to pursue this case.
The couple decided not to press charges. It was a lucky escape for Ramirez. Living on the edges of society, his behavior became more and more unpredictable.
So he's dirty, he's unkempt, he's sleeping in graveyards, he's increasingly kind of going over to the dark side. And the things that appeal to him are things that most people would find really odd and really bizarre, devil worship, that sort of thing. So he's gone on this trajectory now, and I think that's only going to go one way.
Aged 18, Richard Ramirez headed west to California. The Golden State would become his hunting ground. 5 years later, in June 1984, he would claim the first murder victim of a 14-month killing spree. Anyone was a target, and everyone was petrified. Where would Ramirez strike next? By 1984, Richard Ramirez had become a social outcast. Fueled by a hatred of women and a distinct lack of morals, the 24-year-old had settled into a life on the fringes of society in downtown Los Angeles. On Friday, August the 30th, 1985, a mugshot on file from December 1984 was released to all media across California.
When a serial killer is moving around geographically, it's really important to enlist the aid of the media, which can get the word out, sketches and things like that out to the public, because the public becomes an asset to you. And oftentimes, these cases are resolved by somebody recognizing the person.
The following morning, Saturday, August the 31st, 1985, Ramirez boarded a Greyhound bus in Tucson, Arizona, where he'd gone to visit his brother. He headed back to LA, unaware that he was a wanted man.
Saturday morning, Richard Ramirez's picture was front page in every newspaper in the state of California.
When he arrives back in Los Angeles, he gets off the Greyhound bus and somebody recognises him from the picture that's been circulating in the press. And essentially, the predator now becomes the prey. Lots of people start chasing after him. And eventually, they catch up with him, and Richard Ramirez, the serial killer, is no more.
Not surprisingly, given the atmosphere in Los Angeles at the time, they attack him ferociously. Kicking him, hitting him. But he's pinned down by the locals. He's not caught by two of LA's finest or even the police department. He's caught by a group of local onlookers. A true citizen's arrest, you might say.
As the local police arrived to break up the melee, it took a bit of time to realise who they had sitting in the back of their squad car.
This one cop looks real close. He's, Jesus, it's the Night Stalker, it's Richard Ramirez. He goes out over the air and announces they have the Night Stalker in custody.
After 14 months of fear, the residents of California could rest a little easier. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was off the streets and in police custody. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on the 17th of March 1942. The second of three children, Gacy had a difficult upbringing. His father was an alcoholic who was reportedly both mentally and physically abusive to his children and their mother.
His father spent apparently all of Gacy's childhood demeaning him and physically punishing him and telling him how stupid and worthless and effeminate he was.
Gacy's childhood friend Barry Buscelli remembers the physical abuse he suffered at the hands of his father.
If Johnny was 2 minutes late, no food. So a lot of times Johnny ate at our house and stayed at our house overnight. He used to take Johnny when he was sitting at the kitchen table, and he would take his fist and hit Johnny in the face.
The father is a very significant figure in the genesis of Gacy's terrible deeds. For, to my mind, Gacy was always trying to satisfy his father, whom he never could. He was beaten repeatedly by his father, with belts, with brooms. At one stage he was knocked out by him.
These people grow up with such a malignant view of the world and of human relationships, and feeling that human relationships are not based on love and trust and respect, that they're all based on exploitation and cruelty and inflicting pain.
Gacy was a sickly child. He suffered from a heart condition, limiting his involvement in sports activities and consequently alienating him from his peers. Aged 11, an accident in a playground led to his teenage years being blighted by blackouts and hospital visits.
At that time, the swings were wooden base swings with heavy chains coming down. Johnny went to grab it, and the swing clipped him right across the forehead and knocked him to the ground.
In December 1978, 10 miles from Gacy's house, 15-year-old Des Plaines resident Rob Peast was reported missing by his mother. Detectives Mike Albrecht and Dave Hackmeister began to investigate the teen's disappearance.
Rob Peast was like a stellar kid. I mean, he was the kind of kid that anyone would want as a son. Never been in trouble, never had any inclination to run away, was a good student, very, very much out of character. He would turn up missing. So, that caught our attention, obviously.
And at that time in the late 70s, there was a lot of stuff going on with the hippie movement, all that kind of stuff. But he made a determination very quickly that this was not a normal, quote-unquote, runaway. He didn't have any girlfriend problems, was not involved in drugs or anything like that. He was just an all-American good kid.
At the time of his disappearance, Peast was working at a pharmacy in Des Plaines.
So he had told an employee and actually his mother that he was going to go talk to a contractor about a job. And he then went out the back door, and he wasn't seen any time thereafter.
Rob Peast seemed to have just vanished off the face of the earth. The two detectives desperately needed to track down the contractor, who was probably the last person to see him. Their search would lead them to the door of a 36-year-old man by the name of John Wayne Gacy. He divorced his second wife 2 years previously and was now running a successful business called PDM Contractors. Gacy would often employ young men, one of whom was Tony Antonucci.
At the time when I met him, I was about 16 years old. And of course, like a lot of 16-year-olds, I wanted to get a job so I could afford to have my car. My first impressions were that he was basically a likable guy, kind of jovial, liked to joke around, appeared very normal.
Gacy seemed, in many ways, like the perfect boss.
Sometimes at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, John would say, "Hey, it's a nice day out, let's knock off early and have some fun or do something," and all normal stuff, just kind of like you didn't expect, your boss to be the one that wanted to knock off early.
Another young man who'd come looking for a job was 15-year-old Rob Peast, but he hadn't been seen since meeting with Gacy at the pharmacy where he worked. Detectives Dave Hackmeister and Mike Albrecht were investigating.
We ran a records check on him, and as it turns out, he had a fairly lengthy background. He had spent some time in Iowa for sodomy, and so it was sexual crimes basically against children.
Concerned by Gacy's criminal record, the police obtained a warrant to search his home.
The warrant consisted of 3 facts. The first fact is that John Wayne Gacy, in fact, was at the pharmacy the night Rob Peast went missing. And fact 2, that Rob Peast had told people that he was going to see a contractor regarding a job. And fact 3, his criminal background. So on those 3 facts, they were able to obtain a search warrant.
On the 13th of December 1978, police conducted their first search of Gacy's home, finding a number of suspicious items.
They recovered various items of pornography. They recovered some books that were titled Pretty Boys Must Die. They also recovered driver's licenses of other young people. When they did a check on those driver's licenses, it was determined that those kids were also reported missing.
Initially, we were hoping to find Rob Peast alive someplace. And it didn't take long to realize that probably was not going to happen.
Another item recovered was a high school ring, which had belonged to missing 19-year-old John Schick, last seen in January 1977. Further investigation discovered that 2 of Gacy's employees had been reported missing. 17-year-old John Butkovich, last seen in July 1975, and Gregory Godzik, also 17 years old, missing since December 1976. As Gacy's behavior grew more and more erratic, the 2 detectives at least now had a reason to apprehend him.
We make a decision at that point to arrest him for the drug transaction that happened at the Shell gas station. So we cut off the car, pull Gacy out of the car, and arrest him for the drug transaction. Devon in Milwaukee. This was Gacy's final location of freedom.
That's it.
He was never free from this point on.
Grabbed him out of the car. He was all whining to us, why are you doing this to me and all that. And that's where it ended.
So technically he was arrested for marijuana possession and delivery. And then we took him to the station.
While in custody, Gacy told detectives he was experiencing chest pains and was taken to a local hospital as a precaution. But he was just trying to buy some more time. The police had obtained the second warrant they'd been so desperate for. On the 21st of December 1978, they searched Gacy's home on West Somerdale Avenue for the second time.
When they executed that search warrant, they went in the crawl space, and the very first shovel that they dug, they found human remains.
Police had finally unearthed the secrets that Gacy had thought would stay buried forever.
So they immediately called me, let me know that there was human remains in a crawl space, and at that time I arrested John Gacy for murder. Gacy says he wants to confess, but really he wants to confess to the surveillance team, both myself and my partner and the other team. And now all of a sudden he's got an audience again, and he's on top of the world. And he knows he can't get out of it at this point, and so he might as well just divulge everything that actually happened.
Gacy told detectives he was willing to draw a map of the burial site beneath his home.
I gave him a pen and he started right up. He squared it off in the thing and he started, well, this was a double and this was a triple and this was the first guy with put an X on it. Went around the whole crawl space with these places where the body was buried. I mean, they were digging with spoons and everything, but they obviously identified where all the bodies were. And they did an overlay of where the bodies were actually found compared to that diagram that he made. And it was unbelievable. It was right on the money.
In total, 27 bodies were discovered in Gacy's crawl space. It wouldn't take long for news of this horrific discovery to filter out to the wider world.
Then the arrest came down, and that was the headline on the local papers, everything, how many bodies they took out of Gacy's basement.
Well, you know, when Gacy's crimes were uncovered, he entered into the record books, you know, as America's most prolific serial murderer. The notion that this, you know, pudgy, normal-seeming, decent, regular, ordinary guy was living in this horror house, you know, that was just suffused with the stench of death, and that there were the rotting bodies of 27 young men in this crawl space, bringing home and torturing young boys right in the midst, you know, of all his neighbors, and then going off to work the next day.
When we booked him for murder, we asked Gacy where he was born. And Gacy looked at us and said, I was born in a state of confusion. And he smiled like that, and we captured the photo.
In total, Gacy confessed to the murder of 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978.